Hey everybody, Timo here with BASIN. We are doing day 2 of the basinStack work session. The basinStack is a holistic real estate methodology to mint carbon and natural capital assets, but also to figure out what we call the higher and better use of real estate rather than just the highest and best use. So how can we holistically put every piece of property to the highest and or higher and better use for nature, climate, carbon, social impact, whatnot. But basically, how can we do revitalization, restoration, regeneration, conservation at scale? And so that's where the basinStack is coming in. And it's a checklist, but it's also going to be tied to natural capital accounts and ecosystem service accounts. So for today, what we're going to do is jump into some properties. And does everyone have the Miro board too? Let me share that with you. So anyways, go to the Crexy link that Josh shared. And this is a property that Josh found. It's in Portland. Josh, do you want to explain to everyone what you saw with that property and kind of why you brought that up?
Yeah, I thought it was going to be a little annoying at first, but I guess, yeah, it's perfect for this. I was on a bike ride a couple weeks ago, and this is in the middle of the city of Portland. Portland, for people who don't know, is cut down the middle, north-south by a river. So this is on the east side of that. And this is basically adjacent to a big, already like naturally preserved area with kind of neighborhoods going out behind that. And there's just this, I don't even know, it's a sand and gravel potato. And I was biking by, and this area just has the potential to be so many different things. But I saw it had a massive for sale sign on it, and my head, just thinking with refi, immediately went towards this. And so I just thought it'd be like a cool thing to talk about. But yeah, it's like right in the middle of the city, on the water, currently for sale.
Cool. So this one to me, like Josh, like we could maybe do a dry run through it, but this one to me, like with my real estate background, and I think Brian and James would probably agree that in this one is probably going to be snatched up by a developer, like for condos or office building. Like when you guys, anyone who has urban real estate experience, when you guys look at this property on the river in Portland, the Ross Island sand and gravel pit, what do you think is going to go there? Basically, like what do you think the highest and best use of that property is?
Yeah, a lot of them have issues with sub water coming in there, the gravel pits. Lots of times you have reclamation that they have to do. It'd really be an environmental question of what you can build there. Can you build there? I think you're right. Some of our areas in Boise that are similar that were used for gravel, pretty much the only use is we put a whitewater park in one of ours. So you put like a standing wave, and they put a park in there because it's along the river. And that kind of makes sense because a lot of it's difficult to build on because it's subby. There's probably some environmental contamination in various areas if you get digging around.
James, that's a good point about the contamination and water, right? The leaking or surface water or groundwater in there. And so the idea of the stack is us looking at every single thing. It's like a master due diligence list. Like in normal commercial real estate deals, you look at survey, you look at legal, you look at title. But here we add those environmental things to normal commercial real estate. You look at environment contamination as well. But we're going to look at like biodiversity, water quality, water quantity, recreation is one, cultural aspects of one. And this I think we could run through like the stack on this, but it might not be the best example for two reasons. One is the first reason I mentioned with it's probably got demand from other developers. It's not really a trouble problem like Brian had referenced earlier in the call, like trouble properties. Like how do you do something with these properties that are just like on the books, they're surplus, they're excess. So there's probably other developers looking at it. But the other reason is the price per acre on this one. This one is $3.2 million and it's only 3 acres. So they're looking at $1 million an acre. There's no way in heck, right, we're going to be able to natural capital or carbon or regenerative agriculture or any of the stuff we're working on in refi for the most part work on a site like this. So this one would, on an initial screening of the basinStack, would probably get tossed aside. There's not really much we can do with it from our community wins. But let's just go through it. Like on the use on that property, we're just looking at this one in terms of like same thing. What could be done with this for climate outcome, carbon outcome, nature outcome, social impact outcome? Just if you want to work in the Miro board, let's just use this one as property one. And so if you look at the existing use, just like drop in, if you're just observing, like, drop in like sand and gravel pits. We'll just spend a few minutes looking at what the existing use is of the property. It's obviously industrial. And if you guys were to think of it in like normal like real estate terms, like what would you build there, or what would you see being built there, and what kind of income could be generated, rental income? And hey, Seb, we're just working in this Miro board.
Got it. Okay. I will hop on the laptop then.
This is just existing use, not potential.
We can combine it as we're working through it. We could go to the next. We've already talked about existing use. We could go to the higher and best use of it, like potential uses. And I can combine all these cards later. But like, what would you guys see going there if you lived in a utopian society, based on some of the work sessions we did last week of what you want to see in the world when you're walking your street? Or like Josh, like some of the things you mentioned originally, like why, yeah, like a park. Like I just saw you drop that in there. If this site was bigger, like an urban forest would be good. I don't think it's big enough, but that's part of what the basinStack helped evaluate.
Yeah, and this is right next to one of the main bike routes that's on the east side of Portland. Like literally the entrance to this bike route that connects like kind of two areas of Portland is like adjacent to this property. Sounds like part of why I was so attracted to it, because it's also, yeah, just south of this area that's like just really industrial and like in the middle of the city that could like totally be changed in 20 years.
So I put bike connector in there. So the idea of the basinStack is to, like, I could see once we have a format where you actually have a hive mind, like you have meetings around a property. Like Brian, or Will, it's kind of like the design charrettes you guys do, like where you look at something and you say, okay, what could go here? What do we envision? But it's like, how can we do this faster? Instead of waiting 2 months to organize a design charrette and have architects and land planners and engineers evaluate it, like how can a group of ordinary citizens or ordinary people or people in refi analyze these properties quicker, better, and then connect all the tools to properties like this? But so I'm going to give some space for other people just to talk about what you'd see. I see a lot of good stuff in the income category: federal funding, ecological construction materials, storage, green, food, marina storage. Yep. Okay, so any more comments on this one? I think we can discuss at the end, but we're just going to do a couple of these properties. And Hindo, can you drop those comments on the Miro board? Start with art, repurpose existing building, urban vertical farming. Cool, thanks. And then tell me if you can get into this property. This is the property Charlie submitted over the weekend. Let me know if that work for you guys. Okay, Josh's thumbs up. James and Brian, can you see that Notion link? Okay, cool. So Charlie, give everyone a rundown. We'll do this one for property 2. Give everyone a rundown of why you selected this property.
It's about a 30-acre property. It's amazing. It's really beautiful. So very high on, I'd say, on the 8 forms of capital, very high on spiritual capital. It's, I think that there's some Native American village sites around there, and it's basically got it's the Laguna de Santa Rosa. So it's this big laguna, waterfront on the backside of the property. Yeah, ecological corridor. And then on the backside of that, there's, I think it's like 100 acres of open space. So it's been this cool transition area between suburban development and open space, wild space. It's got a really cool long history of community supported agriculture. It was one of the first CSAs in the country, and then has changed hands multiple times. And currently some good friends of mine are farming it. They're young farmers, super awesome regenerative practices, beyond organic, building the soil. But the property itself is in threat of being lost because the original property owner, this guy who was farming it for 30 years, needs to cash out for his retirement. He was a farmer his whole life, so he doesn't really have a retirement. So he's depending on it for that, but he wants it to remain a farm. It's a really interesting use case because, especially for the stuff that I'm really interested and focused on, it's got this super high speculative market value. As a development, like as a subdivision, it would be an amazing property for someone to subdivide up and create 30 or 40 houses, but we'd lose this amazing spiritual, agricultural, cultural space where food and medicine are grown for the community. And yeah, I just think it's a really interesting place for Web3 to do an intervention here. The community definitely wants to keep it. There is a lot of support from the local community for trying to have a land trust or an easement and go onto it. So there's already like interest from the owners there. Yeah, let me know if there's any other questions on it. That's basically the overview.
If you go to their website, the West County Farm,
West County Community Farm.
the pictures are just amazing, and the setting. So to me, this is like the opposite, right, of the first property we looked at. When
Yeah.
you have a rundown riverfront property, industrial, where this is like a thriving operating farm with like a lot of the refi things we're trying to achieve already.
Yeah.
But the problem is like the ownership problem and the price problem. That would use the pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, like you said, it's an interesting use case because it's not this rundown property that really needs remediation. It's already had, there is some more soil building to be done. There's always improvements, but overall, it's like a very ecologically friendly regenerative farm already with a huge amount of community involvement. It's already like doing a bunch of amazing positive social and environmental impact. It's really the ownership structure and like creating some kind of creative solution where we can buy out the existing owner or somehow get him a good amount of money so that he can retire while preserving the land in perpetuity in a CLT or an ag trust or something along those lines, or within a DAO. But I think it's interesting for me as I was like talking to my friends about this idea. I think that was the biggest place where I felt some resistance is, of course, people are very worried or suspicious of turning over ownership to this DAO thing. Most people don't even know what that is, but it's very, I think having some sort of trust ownership as like an intermediary between either a basin DAO or Recommon or whoever in this hypothetical case would purchase the property provides some safety and security for the owners and the farmers.
And mention what you said about the edges. And one of your notes to me, you mentioned about like the connectors in the region.
Yeah, in the permaculture, it's the edges that always have the most interesting things going on, the most fertility. It's the places where two different ecologies are meeting. And this is definitely one of an edge space because basically it's the town of Sebastopol, which is mostly like rural kind of suburban development, but the city is actually pretty close where it's not urban, it's Sebastopol, but it's a semi-urban space. And this farm is really a transition zone between the semi-urban to a wild open space. And it also has a riparian zone where, of course, there's like multiple different types of ecologies. There's like the human ecology, then there's a riparian ecology, then there's kind of oak grasslands on the other side of that. So there's just a bunch of different ecologies that are coming together at this point. And then it's also this cool intersection of food sovereignty, community supported agriculture. There's this really cool thing that they run out of the farm called the Sonoma County Herb Exchange, where people who are growing medicinal herbs bring them there, and then herbalists come and sell their wares. And so it's like a farmer's market for herbalists. So it's like actively producing really nutritious, delicious food for the community and also medicine for the community. So in my view, it's like there's a lot of these pluses where we can really point to and be like, this is really creating a resilient local food shed and medicine shed.
Cool. I love that. Charlie, I love how you use the words ecologies, right? Or different ecologies. And you start to look at it from that perspective as well. And transitional, when you're moving from urban to rural to suburban to exurban. What do the rest of you guys see on this? When you look at that property and maybe comparing it to the first property or just keeping in mind, okay, how could you get a deal done on this property for refi? Like what comes to mind?
Well, definitely like cases where other properties like this will never be sold to developers. They'll be sold to other people with similar interests. So that's an advantage for Regen.
Yeah, I think another positive thing in that regard is that the owner really wants it to remain in agriculture. And as this, it's a community asset. That's what when it comes down to it, this guy lives there and he's run a farm there, but it's really a community asset. It's like 20 years they've run wilderness education, like summer camps for little kids. There's the herb exchange, there's the food, there's all these things. So it really is already like a commons or a community asset. And then now it's just, for me, it's how do we figure out the ownership structure so that Scott, the current owner, can retire, but this remains a community asset. And for me, it seems like that's such a good place for refi to do an intervention. I think on the other side, there's like probably properties that are a little bit more in danger because Scott does really want it to work out and remain a community asset. So whether it's refi or just the normal Sonoma County Land Trust, he's going to do everything he can to try to keep it in the right hands. So I think that's one like downside is there might be properties that are a little bit more like in risk or a little bit a higher level of threat to them. But yeah, I think this property does have a lot going for it.
And James, what comes to mind if Cougar DAO is out there looking for properties? What comes to mind for you? To me, what Charlie said, like it's actually like a crowdfunding opportunity. Like to me, this is either a local community or a crypto crowdfund deal to raise money for it. But what do you think,
Yeah,
James?
I agree. To some degree, most of the things we're doing are already been done. Like you're talking about land trusts, where you want people that can join together to preserve in some form or format a way of life instance aspect of it. I think what makes crypto a little bit interesting, or DAO for that matter, which is obviously kind of where I've been focusing a little bit, is just the ability to put those two together, where you can crowdsource it and give those people some ownership and being able to, I guess, have some governance over the future of that project. If you think about a trustee, it goes to a land trust and it's a little bit opaque. It's a little hard to tell like how that gets run or how decisions get made. Sometimes it's a little stodgy, and maybe that's good, maybe it's bad, but to some degree, maybe it's a little different. This one looks like it's already pretty well preserved and pretty well maintained, but I do see the threat of if this gets sold, maybe it gets houses put on top of it or something. I was zooming in on, I don't want to be like shilling my own stuff, but I went to Farmmapper to put it in there so I can see what it looks like. I can drop that published link in if that helps anybody be able to zoom in a little bit on the stuff that's in there.
And can you share your screen? I don't know with the recording function if it'll let us do it, but if you want to show everyone Farmmapper, that's a good, I guess we can click the link here.
Yeah, I just dropped the link in there and hopefully that'll be the URL.
Okay.
If you click on that, it'll zoom in. I pulled like the deed, but I was just kind of playing around with it and the gravel one too to see what because some of the gravel part I was looking at, some of that was on the neighboring property. I couldn't tell exactly where the four corners were, but this has a bunch of buildings on it and stuff. So I was kind of, is this it? The right one?
Yep, that's right. It's also the parcel up above it. So the fields that are directly north, it's all of those fields as well. It's multiple parcels. And then, yeah, it has a bunch of buildings, a bunch of tiny homes and a bunch of different structures. So it's already like there's community already there. And so there's some rental income. Plus, it's like affordable, good housing for people in a place where it's really hard to find that.
So to me, like there's something that just emerged, a couple things that just emerged here. James is on the call, drops in his app, the Farmmapper that he's creating, is able to pull tons of data super quickly, and he already did it for the first site. So imagine if we can start to scale this where us or an AI or an app can pull all this data and start to help make decisions where we can filter 20, 30 properties a week per se. And then you can get into the human like qualitative stuff later. But James just started that process like right there based on the initial information that Charlie sent over the weekend. And then when I'm looking at James' map, I didn't even notice it on the original map, but then you look at the Laguna de Santa Rosa and it's
the river there.
Yeah. I just looked that up. It's the largest freshwater wetlands complex in the Northern California coast. So to me, like edges, oh wow. And then I think Hindo's still here, but like for Basin, like what we're working to do is tell a story around this. So like Basin would help meet with the farmers, meet with the landowner, meet with the seller, figure out what's the story to then help Cougar DAO raise money, or to someone to implement a regenerative community land trust like governance, or we figure out what that story is around the property, and then all the fundamental levels we need to do. Charlie, we would digging in deeply, like we wouldn't do it now, like in public, but we would ask the farm owner for their revenue, their expenses, and we'd look at what's coming from the property. We'd pull title, and we'd look at water rights. We'd look at mineral rights, if there are any. And if there's not, this is part of the stack. We would just cross that off the list. But what else are we missing? Will and Jeff and I, we've always talked a lot about like water quality, water quantity, biodiversity. What else do you guys see in either of these two properties that could help monetize it, or make it, monetize is a bad word in refi, but to make it financially feasible so that it could actually support itself and be a regenerative asset?
Yeah, to me, it looks like you have a few things. One, water. What are the water rights on it? How reliable are they? But it also looks like there's some solar on it from looking at it. And then just you have all those tiny homes. Like I'd have all kinds of questions on whether those are owned and leased out. Is this like an agritourism thing? Which I think to a large degree where we all start education. With refi, like I think what would make it very extensible is if you could turn it into an education center where people can come and get closer to the land and figure out how to do all these things that you guys are trying to educate people on.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of resources there. It's actually like the neighbor there is the Permaculture Education Center. It's like one of the leading permaculture spaces in Northern California. And like I said, there's already been like many years of educational, like summer camp vibes at the property. And then in terms of the story, that got me thinking about, there's also this really beautiful element that's like definitely harder to monetize, but in terms of aesthetics and just like a beautiful piece of property with beautiful people doing beautiful things, this one I think ranks very high. And it's got this really amazing history of the indigenous people who stewarded that land for thousands of years. All the oak trees that are along the Laguna are all planted and they're all coppiced, and where they bring the branches down. So it's got this like really long history of stewardship by people. And that history, I think you can really feel on the land. yeah, I think it's got a lot going for it in terms of the aesthetics and the story. And yeah, just like giving people the feeling of what a regenerative mini society could look and feel like.
Cool. I love all that. And so to me, like this idea of the stack as an assessment tool, right? If every week we set, like we had a meeting, right, where anyone could join, but if we had the basinStack, you come in, Farmmapper, whoever, like whatever the data is, we can pull. And then you have brainstorming sessions like this, and you see what emerges. Where can the money come from? What's the best tool? What do we need next? What's the checklist? What are the next steps? Like, how can we do this, repeating it at scale? So that's to me like the goal of what we're trying to do at BASIN on any type of property. Any other comments on this one before we jump to the next one?
Yeah, is this
Hey, it's Adam here. What's going on? Charlie, great find. This is amazing. I think I wasn't here to hear about the first property, but it sounds like it's a restoration versus preservation argument. And I think, at least my perspective is that preservation is a lot of times more, or like prevention, right? 1 unit of effort in prevention is worth 10 units of effort in treatment, is a general rule across medicine and environmentalism. So that's just a general perspective, but I agree with everything else that's been said. And it's a really amazing opportunity to experiment with a lot of different business models, and including the community in that business model design process, I think holds a really infinite potential. So super exciting.
Adam, can you drop that quote you used about the treatment and prevention in the Miro? I know you're on your phone, but just later, or DM one of us.
Yeah. I'll just tweet it and at you if that works.
Cool. It's great. Yeah, perfect. So we're recording this. So it's something that's also happening in the chat here. Is the question has come up, is it listed? How much do they need? And all of a sudden we're in deal making mode. So you kind of see where I'm headed with this. If we have the right people on the call and the right resources set up and the right methodology in place. Okay, cool. So this next one is a little bit odd. This is the one I did just a short video on last week. I'm going to do another video on. I was at the car dealership or repair shop getting my truck worked on, and the stream is always stuck out at me. It's in between a Ford dealer and a Toyota dealer along I-70, but you walk down there and the parking lots and the curb are far enough away from the watershed. You're like, whoa, this is like a magical little stream and watershed and ecosystem that's no one's using. There's actually litter and junk, and the trees nothing's been done to the property or this watershed. It's very natural, but it's actually, I would say, like junky natural, kind of like neglected natural. There's not tons of water flowing through the creek, probably because of what's happening upstream in the neighborhoods. But I did some research on it, and it looks like there's 2 things going on. Will, I think you'll get a kick out of this. Is one, it's that FEMA is doing a major flood map overhaul on this whole Mitchell Creek. And so the neighborhood and the city of Glenwood Springs are working with FEMA on this, and they're all up in arms because the flood elevations have changed. And this is happening all across the country, and it's going to happen even more, right? On the coastal cities, spring runoff comes earlier. The flood elevations are changing. So this is going to be a common pattern. Austin, Texas, for example, on one of their creeks had to do like a $300 million buyback because all these houses over the last 100 years got built in this watershed, and they had to get the houses and the people out of the watershed. Will, you deal with it in New Orleans? So like this one is a unique opportunity for, okay, how could a community group like start to mint carbon or natural capital? Who could steward the biodiversity? How could Ford, like Hindo, this is what I wanted to bring up to you. Hindo, how could the studio with Ford or Toyota come together with the city of Glenwood Springs and FEMA and tell a story? And this isn't like it's small in comparison to a lot of big things, but like an acre, it's probably worth doing something. It's an urban location. It's adjacent to a park. It actually could, Josh, to your point about like trails and like bike trails or running trails, it could easily have something like that put in there. But what are you guys' thoughts? What comes to mind when you look at this?
Definitely the recreation. Yeah, if you can add that, I think that's key.
I'm dropping stuff in property number 3.
I just have visions for a pump track bike course.
Cool. It would totally fit in there, Hindo, and it's connected to all sorts of houses.
For sure.
In one of our meetings last week with BASIN, we're talking to a Fortune 500 company. We're talking about like employee and customer well-being. The reason I would have never found this, I would have never walked down by the creek if I wasn't waiting to have my truck service to get an oil change. I strolled down there, poked my head, and I'm like, holy gee whiz, wow, this is really nice to sit here. If there was a trail, if there was a couple of benches, or if there was like signage about the fish or the watershed. Educational comes to mind.
It looks like it's also next to a park. I think it's across the street, like across Center Drive, but having some kind of connection to that park and then into the neighborhood for like actual placemaking is really cool.
That's a great term, Josh. The placemaking. That's what I see. Like a lot of what we're trying to do is actually make place, not just for people, but for like nature also.
Yeah, I gotta give credit to this guy in Portland, Mark Lakeman. He started this thing called City Repair Project, and their whole thing is like, yeah, placemaking. I just love that idea.
Do they just do it in Portland or do they do it nationally?
I think it's Portland, but they're trying to be a model for national. I'll send the link.
Yeah, I actually follow it, and I think it's made its way all the way to Europe. It's pretty awesome. It's again like reclaiming. Like I think one of the big things they do is like reclaim intersections and paint it and turn it into thriving, really cool. Like what if we actually felt ownership over these common spaces? It almost reminds me a little bit of like what happened with COVID, where all the restaurants kind of took over the sidewalks, and now everyone realized like actually this is really awesome. This is like pretty cool that we have life in public, and that it's reclaiming like these urban commons.
And Charlie, when you said that, it reminds me of what James said about doing it in the new way, a crypto refi way, like governed with transparency rather than the old way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think the ability to scale is so much. It's just it's a much higher potential for scalability using refi and using these Web3 tools. Something that I came up for me on this property, Timo, is just it's a really cool example of there's all these spaces in the urban environment that are just like, they're just kind of like the leftover slices of when everything got divided up, or it's just like this, like completely, how many people notice that or think about it? And it's actually like it has the potential to create this really cool park or like trails or recreation out of something that was just essentially like an urban trash heap.
That's exactly it. And I think, Charlie, before you joined, Brian, who's working on the Kansas City project, it brought that up about like how many of these properties are sitting on cities' balance sheets, for example, around the world, like these, as you said, slivers. But there's some big slivers, and then corporations. BASIN was something we're working with big companies on this exact issue. Is like surplus and excess properties. Like one of them can be sold off, the other one can't, based because of zoning and legal requirements and subdivision requirements. But even if it can't be subdivided off and sold and something done, you could still do something. You could still steward that piece of property, even if it's like a weird chicken wing or something as we call them, like a flag lot. James, we call these properties that have a little bit of frontage somewhere, and then they go back to this amazing spot that no one can drive a truck back there. They can't get it approved for whatever reason. It's not big enough for housing. There's some opportunity there. I feel like James already has the Farmmapper going here too.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the right one. When you're talking about it, I thought it was the stuff that followed the creek behind the Ford dealer, but this was the piece that I could find. That one I couldn't pull a parcel for whatever reason. I wonder if it's just riparian area. Maybe it's owned by the city or something. But was this the piece you're talking about, the one that I flagged here?
So that's the actual city park, the watershed, the trees there between the two dealers. That's the one. It turns out, I think, as I dug into it, and so this would have a phase two. Okay, this is what we think we could do. Okay, who owns it? What are the management agreements? And so I think what happened here, James, is this was an easement that the two dealership owners, whoever owns the real estate, it's probably not the actual dealerships. It could be, but it could be separate. They did an easement for the watershed there with the city of Glenwood Springs. So it's not actually it's not actually a parcel itself, but it is a legally described easement. So like that brings in a whole nother layer of complexity, right? Like you have to talk to the easement holder, you have to talk to the tenants under the lease of either of those properties. And there's actually two other properties back there behind. There's a Subaru dealership as well. And then you actually have the property owners. So this is the complexity we're facing, right? With Charlie, some of the stuff we're working on the real world assets circle is once you start to try and connect all these ideas to the real world, what are the next steps? Who do you talk to? What kind of experts do you need to bring in?
Yeah, so I showed the negative space, the space of the car dealerships all around it, and then the space is the stuff remaining, and then it ties into the park, because that would be kind of neat if you could tie this into the park and have that more connected and for various reasons protected.
And so something else, if you go just east, James, on your map there, it doesn't make sense necessarily for refi, but like I could see redevelopers like this big, it's called the, Jeff, what's it called? The West Glenwood Mall, or I guess it's called the Glenwood Springs Mall.
Yeah.
But it's basically an abandoned like mall, indoor mall. It's got a few exterior tenants, like Tractor Supply moved in. But this is like a problem that's going on all over the United States, is these big box buildings there's a website, I think deadmalls.com or something, that like shows a lot of these malls. Like I see the Basin Forum actually working on properties like that as well. Like, you know, we had a meeting with Basin last week about big box reuse. Like how do big retailers that have these big vacant sites, very similar to this mall, how do you reuse it? What do you put in there? Do you put in a museum, a library, school, go-kart track? You tear it down. And like this one, for example, if you look behind it, it has a bunch of vacant land behind it. I'm seeing to the north of the mall. So it's like all of a sudden, like you start to see how these projects could actually become bigger projects. And Charlie, something Jeff and I have harped on a lot is like wild migration corridors. So like these connectors. So not necessarily an example here, but like on some of the rural properties, like how could you start to strategically like connect properties at the edges by looking at wildlife migration patterns? Or Will, do you have go ahead, Charlie, but I have a question for Will too.
Yeah, I just my question there was like, how would one go about quantifying or substantiating those types of claims? I'm sure there are ways. I'm not familiar with like being like, this is a wildlife corridor, and then if we buy this property and we connect it with this park, then this is going to allow this number of species to have a more successful reproductive cycle, or this or that, or what is it, like bird counts, or like what sort of metrics have you seen for not just biodiversity, but like making claims about wildlife corridors? And because I know that's a huge thing, especially for like bigger, more apex sort of species, is having a huge range and having places where you have a park here and you have a park here, and it's so valuable to have an interconnection between there. So I was just wondering if you've run into sort of methodologies around quantifying or substantiating that.
There's been just like tons of studies about fragmentation and the effects of it. And it's been a big focus in conservation biology. So I'm sure there's a robust research out there that we could find.
When you do like a intervention, like that famous conservation corridor that goes over the freeway, they plan to have 4 different scales of tunnels for different animals. So then they can just set up the webcam and watch, but it's like that intentional design, if that makes sense. But then, yeah, you still need forest workers or scientists to do their work, like Jeff was saying. And that's, apps that can listen to bats or radio trackers, whatever it is. So.
Very cool. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think something that I've been wrestling with is, so once you build the corridor, then it's very easy to substantiate and quantify the impact you're having. But I think a lot of these projects, we're trying to create futures or future impact credits. And so that's where it gets a little trickier, where you have to kind of grab the data from this and be like, in this project, biodiversity or the ecosystem was preserved or made better in this way, and our project is similar. And so we're going to be able to like, how do you translate when you don't have, where every case is so unique? I guess that's like the challenge I'm running into, is can we create future impact credits for these things that are so case by case basis?
Yeah, totally. I've only seen it in mines where there's precedent, so they can say this mine in this country, and we'll do another mine in this country. So yeah, I haven't seen it. I don't know. Yeah,
same. I don't have an answer for that, but I've been thinking about all this a good amount. I'm like starting working on a pollinator methodology for Regen Network. And I keep coming back to the point of, okay, what happens when people want to do agroforestry here? Like people want to be measuring different types of biodiversity increases. And I guess once there's all of these eco credits or all this stuff built out, how is that all combined to make sense of what's going on? And I don't know if that's later on, like in the process, once all these eco credits are built out or not. But yeah, I don't have an answer again. I'm just also interested.
So that's like to both those points that you guys were just talking about. If you go to the next column, the far right one, my Miro board pre-selected columns weren't the best for this one. I think we just needed to drop ideas in. But if you look at, I'm calling it data and unit of account. Like what data do we need to achieve those outcomes? To go from like current state to improved state, or higher and better state, if we call it. What data do we need and what units of account? Like that kind of starts to lead into that point, Charlie. And Will and Jeff and I have thought a lot about this, and that's what we're trying to figure out. That's what we're trying to build out, is like the basinStack is like a breadth, it's wide. It's not going to be very deep, but like how can we start to monitor these things, monitor as many things as we can. We look at the baseline and we say, what's the change over time? And then that stack goes up and down along each of those items. And if someone wanted to go really deep on carbon or really deep on pollination, like for example, with Josh's methodology, they could modularly under the Regen registry swap out the pollination methodology or the carbon methodology to really go deep on that. And so in something, James, you brought up that I was thinking about this earlier, actually this morning, is like the charged particles. Like I see a basin ton, right? If we price something from the basinStack in a ton of carbon, but so we call that the bundle. I don't know what we're going to name it, but like The basin bundle is made up of the basin stack. If it's like a charged particle, James, right? Like the bundle is like the NFT, and then you have all these different things that could be smart contracts and feedback, Charlie, to your point about like what are the different baselines or metrics or units of account that someone could then do something. Like if you bought a basin ton of carbon, high quality, bespoke, holistic ton of carbon that has all these co-benefits, but it's actually a charged particle, or it's an IBC token that has all these other channels in it. Like you can actually start to, this is where refi gets super interesting. And I don't know, Josh, I don't know what that looks like in the future, but kind of like, how do you start to manage all that stuff? Like you have to really be careful of double counting. And then the third thing is real estate. And this is something we could work through later, but we talked about this last week, right? Like the services that come from the land, and then you have the land. So like, how do we structure the basin stack or any refi project, for example? Like you have the land, could be in a land trust, not connected to refi at all. It's a nonprofit, it doesn't need revenue. It's got other philanthropic, like charitable donors. But so like for us, like we're trying to figure out is how you actually fund the land itself, right? Like how do you actually go buy a $3 million property at $1 million an acre on property number one, using a charged particle, a series of charged particles that are really just high quality tons of carbon that are chock full of ecosystem services. Is that, is it, you see what I'm saying with all this?
I have two questions, which also feel free to just tell me to fuck off and we can talk about it another time because I don't want to derail us too much. But number one is, do you think that we're like is a ton of carbon the right unit for that? Is that really the least common denominator? Like, why are we even translating it into tons of carbon at this point? Because it seems like the ecosystem services that are being provided for that, a ton of carbon is like such a small slice of that. And I don't know, personally, I'm like really into this idea of moving beyond carbon because I think that there's already so much work being done there. I think that it's a very fraught, I don't even need to start to critique it. You guys all know the problems with carbon. But yeah, so that's one question. It's like, why even translate that into a unit of carbon, and why not make another unit? And I don't know what the hell that unit would be, right? It's like you have to choose some sort of unit of account, and it's hard because you have 10 to 20 different kind of ecosystem services or impacts that you're creating with this basin stack. And then the second, I forget the second question, so we'll just stick with that.
Charlie, that's a really great question and point. And the only reason we've been focused on it is because that's where the market, we see carbon, thanks James, we see carbon as that's driving the refi market right now. And there's not necessarily biodiversity markets. There are water nutrient markets with very few, with nitrogen and phosphorus, but like where is the market for that stuff? Like I was listening to that podcast with Kevin Owaki, and he was talking about impact certificate. ICSO has done a lot of work on this of like, how do you create an impact bond? It's just a tokenized bond, and that's what you're selling. But who's the buyer of that impact bond? If there's like in the net zero world, we're trying to fund, for me at least, Charlie, like we're trying to fund these other, like the things we're all passionate about, like regeneration, restoration, and conservation. And how do you fund that? But like, who's the buyer besides like land trust and philanthropy? Like, how do you convince? How do you make that case around like risk reduction and community health and well-being, and who's going to pay you for a tokenized like unit?
Yeah.
Of that, I'm open if we could create an impact certificate, right? Like work with ICSO and figure out how to sell that, like that. That's what I think we're after.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that's a great full answer. It's like, where's the market for it? There is a market for carbon tons right now. What's interesting about what you're saying is just, I feel if you're trying to compete within the carbon market, yours is going to be, because it has so much more value, it's going to be what, double, triple, quadruple the cost. And if a company's really just going for their little stamp of net zero, why would they buy yours? They buy it because it's providing so much more value, because it's providing like a diversity in their ESG portfolio. And so my brain goes to like, why not just actually be the diversity then? Don't even compete with the super cheap, super shitty carbon, and just be your own impact credit. But it's easier said than done. Like you said, that's basically talking about creating new markets for new impact things. But I think that's where we're going. And I think that honestly, that's the bleeding edge of refi. And I think that's the bleeding edge of all of our organizations. And I think it's important to kind of name that North Star and keep shooting for it. I don't know. I'd love to hear other people's opinions on that.
I think that's where ESG is going too, is trying to like be much more accountable. They've been accused of all this greenwashing, and they're being pretty competitive with each other about trying to get better. And there's groups working on that, independent groups. So I think there will be a market for this in the ESG world. Yeah.
I think there's also like the concept of locality, and that's why making scalable methodologies seems impossible because each ecosystem and each person and fucking molecule is unique in some way. And so I think like focusing on funding, which is one trend that is happening and seems to be going up and enabled by Web3, and like place-based development, which is we're not doing that. And that's the reason a lot of shit is destroyed. So I think that like making a case to someone of, hey, pitch $200 in here. If you have a city of 1 million, you could get 10% of them to pitch 200 to 20K, and tying it to the story of this place that they've been with their kids, it's of course they're going to give you that $20,000. So I think to me, what's the market for this complex mishmash of ecosystem services, cultural services, social services? It's the market that is nearby. It is the people that is nearby and the jurisdictions.
Totally. I totally agree with that. Another thing that has occurred to me is I think that where ESG is going, in my opinion, is also like corporations buying credits that actually offset their type of impact. So if they have really intense impact on water systems, they're going to be buying water credits because that's what. So I think that also like plays into the place-based and just of these credits.
So a good example of that is the climate sprint we did a year ago that Will participated in, who's here. One of the guys worked for a big chemical company. We won't mention the chemical company, but they were worried about the properties that they had contaminated over the years. And they were trying to figure out how to restore them, get the community involved, tell a story around them. And they never even considered carbon. So Charlie, to your point exactly, they did the whole project for like impact. One, they were getting a problem off their balance sheet. They're trying to like restore an ecosystem that they had destroyed to get the financial problem, the liability, but then also regain trust and credibility. But they only were focused on basically water and nature and not carbon. And it could be, right, if you're dealing with Unilever or Nestle, or whatever the extractive industry is you're dealing with, they have a problem in that part of the stack. Like that's why we keep coming back to like stack, like ecosystem services markets. Like I think that's what we're after here is like bundles tend to sell better and are easier to manage when it's because you can't really quantify, at least the way I understand it when I read Robert Costanza's, you can't really quantify each one of those stacks very well, but you can quantify a bundle. It's, I know it does all this good stuff, even though I don't know that 10% of it comes from unit A and 20% comes from unit B and whatever right. So I'd love to unpack that more in impact certificates, or we've always rapped a lot about ESG as a service.
One other idea I'd love to pitch while we're all here, if it's cool. Actually, really quick question for you, Josh. In your pollinator methodology that you're developing with Regen, is that going to be carbon plus pollinators, or is that pollinators as an ecosystem service by itself?
Carbon will be a co-benefit. So the main thing that we're actually measuring is pollinators, like pollinator.
Okay, but when it goes to market, is it going to be sold as carbon plus pollinator benefits, or is it getting sold at directly? This is just a pollinator impact credit.
I think it'll be pollinator impact. Yeah.
And then so anyways, one idea we've been having at Recommon is the group that I work with, and we're working with facilitating and supporting the communities reclaiming commons and really looking at this land layer of the stack. One thing that has occurred to us recently that we're really excited about is that if you put the land layer, if you separate that out, like we were talking the other day, Timo, if you separate that out and have the land be in a perpetual stewardship entity, whether that's a regenerative community land trust or some other land trust where it's a perpetual entity where it's a guarantee that even if the DAO that bought this explodes, for example, Basin DAO buys a piece of property, puts it in a CLT, they still own the usufruct, they still own use rights, they still own all the benefits that are coming off the land. If somehow Basin DAO explodes, there's still like this assurance layer that the land itself will never go back onto the speculative market, and it'll always be stewarded regeneratively. And that's where the RCLT model comes in, is you actually can codify that into the leaseholds, so that you can guarantee that anyone who's leasing that property until the end of time, or until at least the end of the nation state, will have to follow these regenerative practices. So it's this cool piece in the stack where it's either an insurance or an assurance layer, where you basically can create an assurance that these carbon credits that are being sold, because this is happening a lot, where people buy carbon credits and then fucking 5 years later, the property is sold, or the forest burns down, or something happens. And so I think separating out the land and having it be in a perpetual protected legal stewardship entity is just a really cool co-benefit of that that it provides an assurance for the rest of the stack.
Yeah. And then you could even have a secondary market based on selling the digital title of the underlying land that's going up in value, like as the stewardship goes on and on.
Yeah, totally. Because the property itself is actually getting more valuable as it is being regenerated. Yeah. So that's something we've been working on, where we applied for a grant and we're going to start talking to Regen soon, but trying to create like a commons credit. So a land layer credit that's doing exactly that, tokenizing and selling the future impact of taking the land off of the speculative market now and then putting it in this perpetual stewardship entity. Because the other thing is properties are just going up and up in price. There's actually more value to doing it today as opposed to next year.
I love that. And that's so one reason James is here and involved in this is that like Kali DAO, which is KALI DAO, they basically have created a series LLC minting mechanism where you can basically, Charlie, mint your own LLC now. And then Tater is like a fork of that. And they're more, I think, going to be focused on like regenerative properties, but they're working on he's an attorney. So they're working on the land layer of the real estate. Like, how do you tokenize that? How do you securitize the land? How do you sell, like Jeff said, how do you sell the digital title aspect of just to real estate investors, for example? And how do you govern that?
Totally. I'd love to flesh that out a little bit more because it's something that like you guys all have way more experience than I do in terms of the real estate world. So if you sell that digital title, but they don't really have use privileges because the land itself is still being held in a trust entity. How do you see that working, or why would a real estate investor be attracted to that?
So you use just a normal LLC agreement, and this is the whole basin. We've set this up for our tributaries, is what we call them. They're basically joint ventures that can happen with anybody. Like any of these properties, we can form whoever we want to be stakeholders. And like you could use Kali DAO, or eventually you could use like Basin. We want to build functionality, but what we're seeing is we're not going to have to build that functionality. We could fork Kali or fork Tater, or we could just use those, or we could rebrand it, whatever we want. But basically an LLC is just managed the way you want. But it has to be tied to the property level. All the counties, and at least in the US, represent or acknowledge LLC ownership. And you could codify either through a deed restriction, a use agreement, a lease agreement, a conservation easement. There's a lot of different ways you could actually do that at the property level. And then that layer, I get nervous, Charlie, and that and I'm still waiting for someone to prove me wrong on it with this whole like security token. We're gonna take a property, and there's not going to be an LLC. There's going to be 1,000 owners, and we're going to manage this property. And yeah, good luck with that. I want to see a title. Right? Like I want to see you, one, register the title. Two, I want to see like half you guys not brick your wallets and people disappear, and it's just going to be a shit show. So like the idea of you have the land, and then you have a legal entity, which in all cases could either be an LLC, and it can be a nonprofit, right? Like you guys have done work on that.
Yeah.
Around the nonprofits using
it's the same kind of legal operating, where it's the operating agreement that's basically ensuring the regenerative stewardship. How in an LLC would you prevent that from getting changed, like through capture?
So you take it a step further and you put it at the deed level.
Got it.
So
like
you
easement.
You record an easement or a deed restriction, and there's various reasons of why you would want to do that. You could do it with a lease, do what's called a memorandum of lease. And this isn't legal advice, but like you could do it that way, but that's not going to be technically as strong as a deed restriction or easement. And like a lot of the carbon projects are doing, like, to get that permanence, like they're doing a 40-year easement already. So they're doing that at the property level. I think that's something we should look at as part of the stack of like, where do you codify it in the operating agreement? I mean, that's why the Colorado cooperative laws work really well. The limited cooperative association, and that's like what our DAO is going to be, is basically there's like poison pill like legislation that you can put in your cooperative agreement that prevents someone from. So you can start to put this in at multiple levels. You can put it at the deed level, the lease level, and the actual operating agreement level.
Totally. And that operating agreement will have a manager then, or is that a custodial thing?
That's what we're trying to figure out, is like who, depending on back to your guys' points about, Adam mentioned localism and local stakeholders, like who's the manager, right? Do you hire a normal property manager, or do you need a special like farm manager, right? Or you need a special like ecosystem manager to do it?
And like you would put up like no trespassing signs, but what are like the other like bare minimum things you have to do? That's
what we're trying to work out. That's like Neil Spackman always talks about, like the kind of the tragedy of conservation is like when an NGO comes in or a regeneration project comes in a poor community or like a degraded environment, and that property or that 1,000 hectares becomes like the most lush, beautiful piece of property, all of a sudden that becomes the property that's now extractive for food and fiber and fuel. And so you fence. It's like, Jeff, what's the term? You've used it before, conservation by fencing or something?
Oh, wow. Fortress conservation, right?
Yeah, especially in the global south. We don't need to go down this wormhole, but there's such a neo-colonial sort of tint to so much of the conservation efforts where they buy these properties, kick out the indigenous stewards who are, because they're connected in now super fucked up neoliberal global market, exploiting and starting to like chop trees and stuff. But yeah, it's something to definitely be aware of. And I think that I definitely come from a place of my utopia has a high level of interaction of humans with the ecosystem, but humans reclaiming their role. I think Gregory talks about this as like a keystone species of regeneration. Like, how can we actually be a positive piece of the ecosystem? And I think it's super important for us all to figure out how to reframe the story, because there definitely is like the consensus reality that we all live in. The story is that humans fuck up ecologies, and that's just, we can't help it. We just always do it, and we really have to, I think, reclaim and rewrite that story, because otherwise, yeah, that's just the destiny we're going to be fulfilling.
And Charlie Benet hit that hard last week.
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
the humans just like that was dramatic. Like he said he's a segregationist and said keep nature
and that was
people
exactly
separate.
The story, was that like people always fuck up ecologies. It's just in their nature. There's just no way they can't. And I don't know. I don't personally believe that. And also I feel like if that's the basis and the foundation that we're building off of, then in my view, like, we're already fucked. There's just so many people. There's no way we can just like segregate the people into these like weird vertical farmed utopian cities and then have everything else be totally wild. It's not the world I want to live in.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I think this whole like separation of this title and the use of fuck rights is like really good vehicle for land security and tenure for indigenous groups or long-term stewards that have a hard time securing title. Places like Brazil, just a lot of places. I feel like this could be a role of the foundation to do the same model, but instead of the title being an investment tool, it's a community-owned
asset.
It could be used on all sorts of land adjacent to reservations for tribes and so forth. They can reclaim historic land, upland land, instead of the desolate stuff that they got. So I see this as being like a pretty powerful vehicle for doing that.
Yeah, I think that it's just such an amazing tool, that separation of the use of the land and the improvement of the land and separating that from the actual ownership of land. I think that's one of the strongest pieces of the refi ecosystem right now. And it's not just refi, obviously it's like pre-refi. It's fucking a super old idea, actually, the commons.
Yeah, I was watching a video on like last night about the enclosure of the commons in England. And I guess before, as it happened over like hundreds of years, but as it was going on, there was like the lords, whatever, in each like town or small area. There was like during the transition period, still owned a lot of the land around there, but it was for open use for everybody else, for the commoners. And like that, it just got direct connection to like all this stuff. Yeah, it's just kind of glaring to me.
Something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is one of the greatest events of wealth creation in the history of the world was the enclosure movement, the privatization of land. And now we're all pushing on the opposite, the deprivatization of land, taking land off of the private market or off of the speculative market and putting it back into some sort of community-owned pool, commons. How can that also be a wealth creation event? Question number one. Question number two, how is that like an investable idea? How can we get VC or big capital to back that? Because it's literally like the exact opposite pattern as what is the foundation of their wealth. So how do we onboard them, not only on a story level, but also on a financial level? And yeah, there's just this wall I keep running into, is just that like philosophically, I think it's very scary and unattractive to big capital to take land off the private market and put it in the commons. And it's really important question for my organization and for me personally, is like, how do you tell that story in a way that's actually appealing and investable?
I think it's the investors that you approach. The CDFIs, they have 222 billion in the US of capital. So I don't necessarily think it's VCs, right? Like they might be hopping on at the end once they realize, oh shit, this is an exponential innovation. But the CDFIs, we're speaking their language. Hey, we want to develop the land. We want to develop community. We want to develop culture. They're like, cool. How much do we give you? What are the terms? 3% interest, awesome. Loan, here you go. That's what they do. So I think that the big money in terms of VCs and like even investment bankers, that might not even be a conversation worth having like right now when there's already money, but there's people with money and organizations and institutions with money that want to invest in this intention. And I think it's just telling the story of how it's not as risky as everyone tells you crypto is, right? This isn't risky speculative stuff. Like here's the real estate, here's the management practices, here's the science. Crypto is simply a vehicle. Maybe you don't even say blockchain once in the entire pitch, but these institutions, I feel like there's the need and there's the intention. And then there's also like the ESG investment kind of community, which I don't know as much about, but impact investors as a whole, like Impact Investing Institute, they're like teaching investors how to find these things and how to fund them through blended finance, where it's a loan where you only have to pay 30% back. And it's better than full donation philanthropy because you're getting 30% instead of 0%. So I think those people who are thought leaders and showing the investors the way, if we can connect to those people and show them like, hey, here's the potential, share this with your community, I think that could be a good entry point for big money. And VCs are always going to tell you why something's not going to work. But people who are investing with an open heart have a much different kind of filter on opportunities.
Plus, I think a lot of this investment could come from like cities and counties and municipalities. They're like place-based entities. They're not corporations that are spread out. They are like defined places that have, like we said, these little stranded assets, this little in-between things that they own that they're not capitalizing right now. They could all be part of a circular local economy that would be a great investment. Also, there's big stranded assets like oil and gas, and non-producing oil and gas land is like a huge problem on the balance sheets of these companies, and they're at a huge climate risk and they want to get rid of them. So recommoning is probably like a good way to go. It just gets rid of it. Someone has to pay for rehabilitation, but that can come from governments and grants and so forth. But it's not becoming part of the commons, and that would be a win-win.
Yeah, so to echo some of what Jeff's saying there, and kind of Charlie, to move along the lines of where you want this to go, right? Of like, how do you mix people together with land? How do you mobilize the right types of capital? Adam was just mentioning, this is like the core of what BASIN is doing. Like we're internally, Jeff didn't use the word there, but like revenue-based financing is something we're trying to figure out. And so that's like, how do you it's just based on the revenue the land produces. Like how would it pay Recommon or a regenerative CLT back, right, over time? You're not worried about this, like, I have to exit in 5 years, I have to exit in 10 years. It's just whatever revenue, it's a revenue split. In Farm BC, for example, they have some kind of model around that. But also like the climate lease is something we're developing inside BASIN right now. And that is basically a way to mobilize indifferent and agnostic capital is what we call it. Like does capital that doesn't care about climate, nature, carbon, like why would they invest in this deal? And Charlie, that's what the basinStack, that's what we're trying to do, is whoever wants to use the basinStack, it's a way to pay the lease payment, whether that be to BASIN, whether that be to a real estate investor, whether that be to the land trust. Like how do you fund, right? How do you create that revenue stream that funds that purchase?
Yeah.
Depending on how many years you're calculating it. But that's what the basinStack, if we do it right, like the basinStack can mobilize, right, $1 million an acre. Like that would be the holy grail, is like, how do we mobilize $1 million an acre property? Like how do we, through using the stack, right? Like our models right now, and we've been public about this, are like $2,000 an acre or below, maybe $5,000 an acre or below when we use carbon numbers, maybe some other numbers. If you're buying on the open market, you can't buy much for $1,000 an acre, $2,000 an acre, unless you're going outside the US. So the idea of the basinStack is, how do you, like the other property, Josh, we didn't touch on, Josh put it in the database. It's a beautiful piece of an in-holding, like legacy piece of property. I'll just drop it in here real quick before we go. But like the idea with like that property that Josh added, this was going to be one we were going to go over. We're out of time, but this one, for example, like it sounds like an oxymoron, but how do we do conservation development? Like the Colorado State University has a conservation development program. Like how do you actually say, okay, we're going to develop stuff for conservation and make it financially feasible? That's basically what we're doing. So like this property Josh shared, you'd actually put part of it in housing. You might subdivide off a piece for a house or two, but then 80% of it goes into a trust. Like Charlie, like you see, Alec talked about this too, is like, how do you take a property like that one and how do you take maybe the highest commercial part of it and you commercialize it? We need shopping, we need housing, we need industry, but then how do you take the highest like spiritual capital part? I love that term, by the way, of like how do you take the highest natural capital part and like how do you make these capitals work together, or the different parts of the stack? And it's so unique to every single property. You know, what we're trying to do is create a system. So just to keep this in the back of your mind, I think we'll end on that, is like, how do we create a system that anyone can use, even if you haven't been like dorking out on this stuff with Jeff and Will and Thomas for 8 months or whatever, or doing pollination methodology development or land trust development for 8 months or a year or your whole career? Like, how can you come in, get involved, and within a week or a couple hours, right? Adam, this is, I think it's something for you, is like, how do you create a training program or like a toolkit or something where people can just like, oh, I do this and this, here's my checklist, and then I go here and there, and I can do it faster. We can repeat it.
Awesome. Really great chat. Thanks, guys, for answering all those questions. That was, super informative for me. One thing that came up that would be interesting is I think it'd be great to get a document together. Maybe you already have one, Timo, of all these different leaf tricks, structures, pieces, because there's quite a few of them. And obviously they're different in every state and different in every locality, but it'd be really cool to, start to get a list of those going for, like a toolkit.
Cool. Well, I think you need to get more involved in BASIN, and we can reciprocate with Recommon, because this is actually going to go in our docs. Like, we have basically 100 pages of this stuff right now that we haven't shared publicly, and we're getting ready to, but it's going to go in our Git book that anybody can use. And the idea being is that it's better, it's more incentive to do it in BASIN with other BASIN partners. If Recommon is a BASIN partner, or Josh and his pollination methodology is a BASIN partner, there's like in-network incentives. And then like, that's the BASIN refi mechanism to keep doing this at scale and have a whole pool of assets that the regenerative actions are actually creating pools of assets that we can do more of the regenerative action on. So
sign me up. Sounds great.
Cool. Thanks everyone for all your work and participating. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks.
See you guys.
You guys.